Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Book 1 of Marcus Tullius Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, the character Velleius is going to present the Epicurean position and make one key argument in favor of the existence of the gods. And this turns out to be closely connected with, we could call it, an epistemological underpinning of the Epicurean perspective. And it's mentioned as being discussed in a work that we no longer have, the rule or standard of judgment, the Criteriu e Canon, which unfortunately, like most of the Epicurean literature, we've lost, but the people discussing this in Cicero's time would have had access to. And the argument that's going to be made here is one that is typically called, in the literature of philosophy of religion, the argument from common consent. And it's viewed as not a very good argument at all. We'll see why in just a moment. But here it's being connected with a particular idea of Epicurean philosophy, which, by the way, will also go into some Stoic philosophy later on. And it's got some similarities with ideas that you see other people who are not Epicureans espousing later on as well. So what is the argument? We're going to follow along the portion of the text. And he says that Epicurus alone perceived or saw, vidit, that gods exist. And why did he see this? Because nature itself, natura ipsa, right, very nature of things, impressed on every mind, in omnium animis, we're going to come back to that in a moment, a conception of those gods, eorum notionem. So, notice here that the argument is not for the existence of God, singular, but for the existence of gods, plural. And the idea here is that we have some sort of notion, all of us, that we share some sort of concept, notio, right, of the gods, and it is impressed upon all of our minds by nature. How that actually happens, we'll look at in just a moment. So that's one key part of the argument there. And then he says, in terms of a question, what nation or what tribe of men is there but possesses untaught some preconception? So now he's introducing the term of the gods. So every portion of humankind, whether it's a gens, whether it's a genus, right? So any group that you want to have possesses some sort of preconception, anticipatio or anticipationem in the Latin there. This is what's getting translated as preconception, and you might say, well, how do you get the English preconception out of anticipatio? Well, it's because the Greek is actually closer to that prolepsis, and that is the term that Epicurus had used. So pre, right? Lepsis, the Latin term capere, to grab, to seize, works just fine for the lepsis in that, the lepen. So all of us have some sort of idea, every single group of us. So therefore, the gods must exist because we all have the same preconception of them. And he goes on and he says, Epicurus designates these notions by the word prolepsis. And what is a prolepsis? He says a sort of preconceived mental picture of the thing. So antekepton, taken in advance. Informationem. Now, we have a tendency, if we see a term like that, informatio, to easily transpose it into English, and we're like, oh yeah, information. I know what that means. So if we get back to the earlier, less passive sense, where information is just data that's given to us, right? That's what data means. And we think about this, what informatio actually means. Forma, right? The shape, the structure of something, and it's placed within us as something that we get. So it's not just preconceived, but it has some sort of structure to it. And then the Epicurean Velleius is going to go on and say, if we don't have these prolepses or preconceptions, then nothing can be understood or investigated or discussed. This is required not just to talk about the gods, but anything whatsoever. So the case of the gods, you could say, is a specific case of something general about Epicurean epistemology, how it is that we come to know things. So without this, we can't understand intelligi, we can't seek out or inquire, quaeri, or even disagree, disputare. We can't discuss these things. But we can, so we have these prolepses. So far, so good. You might be saying, I'm not quite sure I buy all of this, but let's see where it leads to. So he goes on and he says, the foundation of our inquiry is well and truly laid. Why? Where did we get belief in the gods from? Now you could say, well, everybody believes in the gods because people have talked about this and it's part of cultures, but that doesn't mean that they actually exist, right? I mean, we talk about all sorts of imaginary things that are just part of folklore, and we don't think, for example, werewolves exist or dragons or anything like that. And he says, well, where did this belief, this opinio in the gods actually come from? How has it been established? Constituta. How has it been placed within us? So it wasn't by authority, instituto, right? So it's not coming from some sort of earlier decision making. It's not from custom, more, and it's not by laws, although there could be certainly customs and laws that have to do with the gods. But first you have to believe in the gods before you're going to have customs, laws, or we could just call it institutions or decisions, right? So if it doesn't come from that, where do we get this idea from? He says, instead, it's on the unanimous and abiding consensus of humankind. So, ad unum omnium, right? Unanimous. Every single person believes in it. Now, they're going to take that back in just a moment. Firma consensio, an agreement, a consensus, right? And firma, abiding. So, everybody throughout history, at least history up till that point, has believed in God. So their existence is a necessary inference, as the translation here says. Sticking a little bit closer to the Latin, it is understood, intelligi, necessarily, necessa, that the gods exist. And again, notice something very interesting about this. Plural, right? It's that the gods, not a god, not the god, but gods exist. And why? Because people have this common consensus in this. And so this is why we call it the argument from common consensus or consent, and this is an early instance of it. Where is this idea? How does it get in there? Cicero will have Velleius do a little bit of clarification. He says, we possess an instinctive, incitas, or rather, more correctly, innate, innatus. And then he says concept, but it's actually concepts. Cognitiones, right? Cognitio is a concept of something. So it's not just that we have like a vague sense or something like that. We have an actual idea within all of our minds, or actual ideas, plural, of gods. And so he says that, listen, if everybody believes in this, then it must be true. A belief that all humans have by nature must necessarily be true. Now, this is where one of the weaknesses of the argument comes up that will be criticized a bit later. Think about what is being committed to here. Necessarily. Something that all humans believe in must necessarily be true. And you could say, well, what if everybody is mistaken about something? Think about sensory matters where, the stick looks crooked when we put it into the water. Everyone sees it that way. It doesn't make the stick crooked. And so there's a little bit of problems here. But this is the argument that is being made. Then there's a little bit of hedging that's going on. And it has to be so because Velleius and Cicero, his, narrator here, knows that not every single philosopher actually believes in gods. So he says this truth is almost universally accepted. That almost is pretty important there. Not just among philosophers, philosophos, right? But also uneducated or unlearned people, meaning people who haven't studied philosophy or the part of philosophy that has to do with this, indoctos, those who have not been taught. So he says, if that's the case, we must admit it as being an accepted truth of which we possess a preconception. And now he's going to also give us a clarification. We can call it a preconception, right? We saw that term earlier, anticipatio, corresponding to the Greek prolepsis. Or we can also call it a prior notion, which is really just an English transliteration of praenotionem. Praenotio would be the nominative here. So before, prior, notio, a concept, a notion, an idea of something. And so he goes on and he says, we have this of the gods. He excuses Epicurus a little bit, saying we have to use novel terms to denote novel ideas, just as Epicurus himself employed the word prolepsis in a sense nobody had used it before. So this means that we have, and he goes on a little bit further to talk about these preconceptions. And that's where we get into the actual nature of the gods. The gods are not just existing, but also immortal, blessed. He'll go on so far as to say that we can even talk about or infer from what their shape must be, a human-like shape, from this preconception. But what we're interested in here is not all of that stuff. We're interested in, do they even exist in the first place? And the Epicureans would say, yes, based on this argument from common consent. And the common consent is ultimately coming from the fact that we have a preconception or prolepsis of these gods.